Hello, Habitus community. I hope everyone is doing well these days. I'm sending you this video because I want to explore with you the practice of fasting. Fasting is probably one of the most neglected Christian disciplines in North America. And in our Habitus community over the past years, it's probably the one practice that many have struggled with the most. So I want to take some time to explore this practice that Jesus assumed would be normal for us to engage with. I'm convinced that part of our struggle with fasting in North America is that we live in a culture of comfort and consumption, and that culture shapes us quite profoundly. In our consumer culture of constant abundance, many people struggle to see a rationale, what reason for this practice of fasting. We live with food excess all around us. And strangely enough, at the same time, we live with a culture where we worship the body and a very particular ideal of the body. And think of all the mixed messages we get from that. We have gourmet magazines of decadent foods, all the food porn on Instagram. And then we have magazines and Instagrams of ripped, perfect bodies. Confusing? You bet it is. And this confusion about food and our bodies results in things like eating disorders, big issues with body image, self-worth, obesity rates, food waste, food injustice. And so we have this tension. We live with a hyper-consumer culture focused on comfort and pleasure on one side, and then on the other, this idolatry of bodies where we're led to diet, to work out, to restrict our food intake. And so as we consider this practice of fasting, let's do it thoughtfully, because fasting can quickly draw us in wrong directions if we don't understand the practice and if we don't understand some of the culture. It can lead us, for instance, into an increased distortion and focus on our bodies and diets instead of leading us to focus on God. And yet, even in all our abundance and consumption, there still is an unfilled hunger. There's a lovely sonnet written by the poet Malcolm Guite, and there's this haunting line in that sonnet. He writes, "In our abundance, something starves and yearns. We crave fulfillment, crave and are denied." So where does this craving, this hunger get filled? The sonnet continues and he writes, "And then comes one who speaks into our needs, who opens out the secret hopes we cherish, whose presence calls our hidden hearts to flourish, whose words unfold in us like living seeds. Come to me, broken, hungry, incomplete. I am the bread of life. Break me and eat." In our practice of fasting, it's Jesus we seek, to be filled by Christ, the bread of life. And the practice of fasting is a gift for us in our consumer culture, a gift that helps us break free from so many distortions of our pleasure-centered, comfort-oriented culture, and a practice that helps bring our bodies and our deepest heart desires in alignment with the way of Jesus. Now, before we look more closely at some of the practicalities of fasting, it's important to lay down a piece of Christian theology. And this is a critical foundation, and it's simply this: your body. To be a human in the Christian story is to be an embodied person. Your body, my body, they are central parts of who we are. You don't have a body, you are a body. Of course, we're more than a body. Your mind is more than your brain synapses firing. We are a body and spirit, an integration of material and immaterial. This is embodied spirituality. And throughout the Christian story, the body is significant. And I think we need to let that truth sink deeply into our imaginations, into our hearts, because otherwise I don't think fasting will ever make sense for us. Theologian Scott McKnight has written a really fine book on fasting, and he observes that fasting has fallen away so much because we no longer see a connection between spirituality and the body in the West. He says we're still living out this dualism, this division between soul and body, with the soul being immortal and given this privileged status, and the body being mortal, something that we seek to get free of. And so McKnight writes this. He says, we have minimized the body so much in our spirituality that fasting has become unnatural. I think we can relate to that. In the book, McKnight talks about some of the ways we understand our body. He calls them 4 body perspectives, 4 ways we commonly think of our bodies. One is we think it's a monster to be conquered and tamed. We're afraid of our bodies and its desires, and we need to just tame it. It's also, he says, a celebrity to be glorified. And so we're dedicated to tight buns and 6-pack abs, to sleek and trendy clothes. Another one, a third way we think of our bodies, is that it can be a cornucopia to be filled. We seek pleasure to experience comforts and goodness, and so we stuff our faces. Or fourth, the body can be a wallflower to be ignored. We want to get free of our bodies. We want to elevate ourselves to higher things through contemplation and mysticism. I encourage you, take a moment right now, and maybe you just got to press the pause button on this video. Take a moment and reflect on these 4. Which of those best describes the way you think about your body? Now, when you think of fasting, it is probably one of the most deeply embodied practices we engage with. Fasting is a way that we pray with our stomachs and with our bodies. We fast in part because something has gone wrong with our bodies. You know, we can read this already in Genesis 3. The first sin of humanity is one of rebellion, but it's a deeply nuanced story about how that happens. It's about food. It's about bodies. It's about desire. The temptation was to redefine good and evil. The temptation to trust our own selves instead of the voice of God. But the means of temptation is food. Now, fast forward from that Genesis 3 story to Matthew 4, the life of Jesus. And at the very beginning of Jesus' life and ministry, we read about what? The temptations of Jesus. Jesus is tempted in the wilderness by what? Food. Turn these stones into bread. Of course, Jesus quotes Deuteronomy. No one lives on bread alone, but on every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Jesus is saying to the tempter, you're confusing my physical hunger with the deeper, greater appetite in my soul that bread will never fill. And Matthew here, he's echoing Genesis, right? Jesus is replaying the garden story all over again. Here's the tempter. Here's the temptation, which is food, but not really about food. It's about a deeper desire. But Jesus overcomes, and Jesus is opening up a whole new way of life and freedom. And how did he do this? What is the way of Jesus? Silence, solitude, prayer, fasting. And then right after the temptation in Matthew 6, Jesus, in his Sermon on the Mount, names 3 key practices: prayer, giving to the poor, and fasting. Now, if we had to name the 3 most important faith practices, I bet many of us would not include fasting in that list. And yet, there it is from Jesus. He says, and when you fast, not if, when you fast. The assumption is his followers would fast. But really, how often do we fast? I think the truth for most North American and Western Christians is that fasting is not a regular part of our lives with Jesus. You talk to Christians in other parts of the world and they would absolutely say fasting is, but for us in the West, it's not. And again, I think it's connected to our consumer comfort-oriented culture. But I love how Jesus talks about fasting. He says, first of all, don't do this like the hypocrites, which means Jesus assumes we will practice this in distorted ways sometimes. Sometimes we'll fast to do it for a reward with God, thinking, oh, if I do this, God will give me some special things. Or maybe we'll do it to lose weight, or we'll do it for people to think we're really spiritual. And Jesus says, don't do it like that. How do you do it? When you fast, put oil on your head, wash your face so that it won't be obvious to others that you're fasting, but only to your Father who is unseen. Here, I think we catch some of the rationale for the practice of fasting. We fast to seek God's face. We fast for communion with God. We fast not so that others are going to see us, but we fast only to your Father who is unseen. It's a Godward practice. And in fasting, we're opening up space to settle into our relationship with God, the God who sees us and knows us. Well, let's shift gears into some of the practicalities of this practice. What is fasting? Maybe we got to start there. A definition. Commonly practiced fasting is the intentional abstinence from food for a certain period of time. And the usual type of fasting involved not eating anything from sun up to sundown, usually a 12-hour fast. Sometimes it might be from sundown to sundown, a 24-hour fast, but rarely does a fast last beyond 12 hours. Sometimes it does, but very rarely. Now, let's also distinguish the practice of fasting from something else, from abstaining from desserts or watching Netflix or shopping. Now, those can be good disciplines. Those can be helpful renunciations. But in Scripture, fasting is about abstaining from food. And so I encourage all of you, when you think of how you're going to engage this practice, to consider what form of fast from food you might practice. But even as I name that, I want to name an important caveat. If you have health conditions, if you're pregnant, if you live with any form of eating disorder, a food fast then is not recommended. I would encourage you to consider other forms of fasting and abstinence. Perhaps it's going without coffee. But you think through, is there another form of abstinence that you can engage in place of a fast? Let's do this wisely. If you need, get medical advice, as it might be helpful. Now, the Bible presents fasting as a responsive practice, not as something instrumental. Now, what I mean is fasting is not an instrument, a way in which we pull strings to get things from God. Fasting, it's not a display to God about how serious we are in requesting something or in our relationship. It's more about aligning ourselves fully with who God is and what God is doing in the world. So fasting is often a choice to not eat for a set period of time because you've discerned something. In a moment, you've sensed something serious or sacred calls out for a response. You see that in the Bible. When Israel sinned, they responded with their bodies in fasting. David, you might remember, prayed for his child conceived in sin. And what does he do? He fasts, he prays. Fasting can be a response to the injustice in the world around us. What do you do when the world around you is collapsing, when it just feels like evil and justice seems to overwhelm? For people whose hearts and bodies are unified, integrated, fasting just feels like a pretty natural response to that. You see this in Judges chapter 20. And in response to just horrible depravity, to perversity, rape, and murder that was happening, the people respond to this evil with fasting. We read in Judges 20, all the Israelites went back to Bethel and they wept. Sitting there before the Lord, they fasted that day until evening. So again, this bodily response to an injustice, to something serious you see. Sometimes fasting is in response to the failure of others, when the moral core is slipping. Moses, when he came down from Mount Sinai, had the Ten Commandments in hand, saw what was going on, threw down the tablets, and fasted before the Lord. Why? Because of the sin committed by the people. So fasting is often an appropriate response to moral decay that we see around us. Now, think of that. Wouldn't that be a beautiful thing if God's people, instead of responding with outrage about the moral failures of others, instead of posting our indignation on social media, wouldn't it be beautiful if instead God's people fasted, seeking God's face? Biblically, it's one of the most appropriate responses to injustice and moral decay we see around us. Which means fasting is often understood as a justice practice, a way of aligning ourselves with God's justice and in solidarity with the poor of the world. Fasting is always connected with God's heart of compassion for those in need. Think of Isaiah 58, which shows us how the practice of fasting actually trains our appetites to hunger for more of God's kingdom in the world. Isaiah 58 says, "Is this not the kind of fast I have chosen to loose the chains of injustice, untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke?" In our surrounding culture of consumption and excess and comfort, don't you think fasting just might be the most helpful, appropriate, regular discipline? Sort of a regular bodily renunciation to that culture around us. And so Christians have made fasting a part of their regular practice, a regular bodily response to God. Fasting is also a revealing practice. It helps us to surface ways that our hearts are turning away from God, the way we might be finding satisfaction in lesser things. There's an author, Carol Langston, has written a book on fasting, and she writes, "The discipline of fasting is a tangible, visceral reminder that we ourselves are probably the greatest obstacles to change that we are going to encounter." That's sort of a sobering word, isn't it? Fasting is revealing about perhaps there's something in us that's a problem. And I wonder if that's also part of why we avoid fasting, because it reveals something in us. Richard Foster writes, "More than any other discipline, fasting reveals the things that control us. We cover up what is inside of us with food and other things." You've all heard the term hangry, right? Hungry and angry. Going without food surfaces sometimes some of the ugly stuff we often keep well hidden. And so Richard Foster continues writing about this revelatory quality of fasting. He says, "If pride controls us, it will be revealed almost immediately. David said, 'I humbled my soul with fasting.'" He goes on, "Anger, bitterness, jealousy, strife, fear, if they're within us, they will surface during fasting. At first, we'll rationalize that our anger is due to our hunger, and then we know that we are angry because the spirit of anger is within us. We can rejoice in this knowledge because we know that healing is available through the power of Christ." And so fasting is part of our healing as well. The physical act of fasting as a regular discipline is a response to the healing call of Jesus to die to ourselves. It's a renunciation of all the attachments of our hearts so that we might properly attach our hearts and lives to God. So this more regular form of fasting was evident. We see it in Jesus. Jesus and his followers likely fasted twice a week like most other Jews. And we read that in the early church, from a document called the Didache, we read that the church fasted on Wednesdays and Fridays, fasting from food during the day, and they would break that fast during the evening meal. They never fasted on Saturday, the Sabbath, or on Sunday, the Lord's Day, because those are feast days. So I encourage you, don't fast on those days. Instead, find another day. But fasting was considered a core practice in the way of Jesus. And it remained a regular practice until fairly recently. For instance, John Wesley noted this, once observed this: the one who never fasts is no more in the way to heaven than the one who never prays. Now, that's a sobering word, isn't it? That almost strikes us as a little crazy. Putting fasting on the same level as prayer? It feels probably very out of step with our daily lives. But perhaps what's crazy is our consumer culture. Perhaps what's crazy is how dulled we've become by filling every appetite so focused on comfort and pleasure. So in our Habitus community, our rule of life, we want to keep our hearts in touch with their true home in God. And so once a week, we practice fasting. We're trying to discern what sort of fast is going to be most beneficial for our growth, what's appropriate to our unique personal season and needs. Real quickly, let's go over a few details. 1, pick a day that works for you. You're never going to engage this practice unless you plan for it. So set out which day of the week you will engage the practice of fasting. As I mentioned earlier, Christians have traditionally fasted on Wednesdays or Fridays, but find a day that works best in your weekly rhythm. And I would encourage you to speak with others in your trio. And if it's possible, pick the same day to do this together. I think just the fact that doing it with others is a helpful encouragement. I bet it'll enliven your weekly practice, and it will be helpful to sort of debrief together as a trio. Try first a 12-hour sun-up to sundown fast, and then break that fast in a simple meal in gratitude. And if a sun-up to sundown fast is too much for your body, for your soul, whichever, just start smaller. I think the operative principle here is do as you can, not as you can't. Do as you can, not as you can't. So maybe take a pass on breakfast and break the fast at lunch, or maybe a little later, push it a little later to 3 p.m. The goal, of course, is to make fasting a part of your regular life. Not to try it once, twice, to hate it, never do it again. Do as you can, not as you can't. And remember that fasting creates space in your schedule. Think of all the time you normally be grocery shopping or cooking or eating or cleaning up after yourself. Use that time to give yourself to prayer. And let the grumbles of hunger that you're going to feel, let that be sort of a call to prayer. Let that be a pointer to Jesus, to the bread of life. As you fast during the day, go about your activities as normally as possible. You might need a slower pace. So on your day of fasting, you might schedule it a little bit lighter because your body's probably adjusting to reduced energy. But throughout the day, as you're able to, enjoy God's company. Attempt to open your heart to God throughout the day. And a few simple tips. Remember to drink lots of water. Stay hydrated. So important. And if you normally start the day out with a cup of coffee, like I do, you might still want to have coffee, but maybe have it black. I'm not a purist on this one. I put a little cream in my coffee. I'm okay with that. I think Jesus is too. But you discern how you're going to engage that. And as I said, as you're able to, make it a goal to sort of slow down. Maybe during your lunch break, find a park, take a walk. Give as much attention to God as is doable within the schedule of your day. And also anticipate resistance. Hangry is a real thing. But I urge you, resist the compulsion to judge your experience. So let go of early judgments about what you're experiencing as you fast, whether it's really positive or whether it's very negative. And just trust the practice. Offer it to God in love. And perhaps the day after your fast, take time to reflect on it. Journal your thoughts in response to questions like, what was your experience like? What happened? Where did you feel resistance? Or where did you sense God's presence during the day as you fasted? Well, I hope this has been helpful as you begin to make fasting a part of your weekly rhythm. I wanted to make sure that we provide some instruction because it is a challenging discipline that we're not well versed in. As always, I am so happy to respond to any questions you might have, and please know I am praying for you. God bless.